Welcome to Chax Poetry Talks, a podcast brought to you by Chax Press. This is Charles Alexander. I'm your host and speaker. You can find Chax Press online at chax.org. And now, the podcast. Welcome to the podcast. This is Charles at Chax Press. I always feel like I have, to some extent, found my own way into and through poetry, particularly the poetry of our time. And I take our time to be maybe the last 75 years or so, but also earlier times, other cultures. Yet I have to say, I had some good pointers, some good training, including at schools. But even that sometimes feels almost accidental to hear something that then sets you afire to find out more. And I do believe both the practice of poetry and the practice of really having poetry in your life is all about that desire to find out. I recall, beginning high school and college, I had only read older poetry, and certainly as I began university education, in one of the very first classes I took, I read William Carlos Williams, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, and H.D., among as well the prose writers, fiction writers of American modernism. And that was a good base, but even that perhaps did not quite prepare me for what I heard one day in a class on, a couple of years after that, on poetry of the late 18th century in England. And the professor of that class was a poet himself, Donald Davy, who wanted to read something from an American perspective on that period in the 18th century. And so he read us a poem by a contemporary living American poet who he knew, who I would later come to know, that takes place in that period. And this is a poem by Edward Dorn. And I'll say more about Dorn in a bit, but I want to read this poem, which is called Ledyard, The Exhaustion of Sheer Distance. And I'll say a little bit about the poem first. It is about John Ledyard, who was an American explorer, you might say, but known greatly for walks of long distance, of sheer distance, whether that be to the source of the Nile and back, or whether it be across Russia, wanting to go all the way across Russia, which you will hear more about in this poem. Dorn provides context, though. He is interested in history. So Jefferson is in this poem, and Catherine the Great, the Queen of Russia, has a role to play in this poem. He's interested in history and geography. He prefaces this poem with Ledyard's own words, which are simply, "I give up, I give up." Around the Horn with Cook, in the swell of the summer tides, all the trickery one could ask for, of onslaught. One could ask for nothing more. And of course the journals were suppressed, though all marked was the tenor of the passing earth. The jealousy of location was the same sheerness as the marking. On the ghostly coast, indolent Spaniards thought Mary could possess by flags the squatter's occupation had not yet come. Still the dreamy hurrying, Vitas bearing, and the trip back to Petersburg for fresh supplies to be yoked by scientists, those curious, argumentative people who took 7 years returning to Kamchatka one way. Meanwhile, the blood of the Aleuts ran in Norton Sound, and Ledyard, regardless of the date, left for Europe. Where Jefferson said in Paris and Jones agreed, "Go to Kamchatka and thence across," and Ledyard went, although not a one of them had any money, but due to some complicated unfixing sojourners could travel broke, tramping as he did from Stockholm to Petersburg, around the Sea of Bothnia, and they don't say he stopped in taverns or what condition his shoes. The point of destination was the Pacific coast of Russia. There was a way to get to the other side of America. And that must have been no irony then. Walking is what I associate with Ledyard. Distance as sheer urge, not satellite and its utilitarianism. A wild 1,000-mile walk in the cold to Petersburg, thence to Barnaul, midway with Dr. William Brown. People were everywhere then looking at flowers. Exhibitions came long after. There was no place to go. Where, when he got to Yakutsk and met an old mate who had been also with Cook, he went to Irkutsk, where Catherine's Cossacks jogged up, red-faced, and seized him in a confusion of towns named Yakutsk and Irkutsk, and carried him on a horse 6,000 miles back, where they set him down just inside the Polish border, from where probably he walked at least part of the way back to London, which is where he said, "I give up." But what I wonder at times, being only from Illinois, is, did you count the stretching corridors of spruce on that trek coming back, as we used to count telephone poles, going home from my aunt's on an endless, rainy Sunday afternoon, where shortly after the beginning of an American Siberia, but the mystery, when did our Poland occur? Like your spirit, and bones to dust then set out for the African Society to discover the sources of the Nile, a mad Mark Antony, the legions of the weather of the earth at your back, and on the way out fell. Mystic sheer distance was in thine eye, that beautiful abstract reckoning, the feet walking, for no other reason, the world. I think you can hear this is a kind of ideal for Dorn, not the politics of government which get in the way, or possibly spur one on the way but provide no support, no money, no income, and at the worst capture one, as Catherine's Cossacks did in that confusion of towns named Yakutsk and Irkutsk, and stop that beautiful abstract reckoning, as he calls it at the end of the poem, from having a chance. This is really a poem about the human spirit, and yet the difficulty of allowing its work to be done. To me, Dorn was an entry, and this poem was the entry. I followed his work, found out he was a student at Black Mountain College after he had been an art student earlier in the Midwest. He studied under or with, in some ways, Charles Olson, who I will definitely get to in probably more than one of these podcasts at some point, and with Robert Creeley, who I have already talked about in 2 different podcasts. And so that led me to this kind of I think it gets called a movement now, Black Mountain Poets, but I would rather call it a company of very different kinds of poets, but who nonetheless had some commonality of vision. Dorn, perhaps one of the most careful and elegant of these poets. And I think that elegance, and what I believe it was Robert Duncan called the sort of Elizabethan sound of his syllables, caught me. He says in a later poem, and this is from a fantastic longer poem called Idaho Out, in the second part, "My desire is to be a classical poet. My gods have been men and women. I renew my demand that presidents and chairmen everywhere be moved to a quarantine outside the earth somewhere." So he understood in probably the 1960s, and I want to say early to mid-60s when that poem was written, the plutocracy in the USA, in which presidents have seemed to serve at the behest of corporations and chairmen, and what damage that does not only to that abstract reckoning that he admires so much of the human spirit, but also to people's lives and to the continent as a work, as an ecosystem. Dorn died several years ago, well, more like a decade or so ago, and left us with a huge body of work. This is from the collected poems, which are worth reading in their entirety, as is the long poem Gunslinger, sometimes published under the name Slinger, which is an epic of the American West and is the West functioning under the dissolution of any kind of American value system. I think as we look at what is happening right now to ecosystems, to the situation of race in America, the ongoing presence of the brutality of white supremacy, Dorn is a clear voice for something else, not necessarily solutions, because I don't know that poets often have solutions, but an eye into the problems, an eye into the issues. If Dorn also would lead you to such as Duncan, Olson, and Creeley, that would be a great value. I want to read just one other poem by Dorn before ending today. And this, I'm reading from the collected poems, which is 1956 to 1974. He takes on in even later poems a kind of archly satiric tone with an eye that looks at all sorts of contradictions of our time, problems of our time. But a part of that starts early. And this is a poem called Executioner, Stay Thy Cold Blade. And it has perhaps some troubles with what he calls the thoughtful efforts of man. As knowledge grows, it becomes apparent that the brain is a machine of a type very different from those made hitherto by the thoughtful efforts of man. Its success is largely due to the richness of its parallel circuits and its redundancies. This makes it very difficult to assign particular functions, especially by the technique of removal. So perhaps not for the faint of heart, Edward Dorn, although he has beautiful love poems, wonderful visions across the American landscape, and a kind of music that I find entirely his own, and that is something that I particularly enjoy. He also, growing up in the Midwest in pretty poor farmland, has a great eye for what life may have been like in the 1930s, 40s, etc. And I will just read the beginning of a poem called Sousa. And of course, Sousa is celebrated now as one of the great American composers. But Dorn begins his poem, "Great brass bell of austerity, and the ghosts of old picnickers, ambling under the box elder when the sobriety was the drunkenness. John, you child, there is no silence you can't decapitate. In unforgotten places, the octagonal stand, Windsor, Illinois, the only May Day of my mind, the fresh breeze and the summer dresses of girls once blew, but knew not now. They blow now at the backs of our ears, John, under the pinon, that foreign plant with arrogant southern smell. I yearn for the box elder and its beautiful bug, the red striped and black plated, your specific insect in the Sunday afternoon. Oh, restore my northern madness, which no one values anymore, and shun its uses. Give them back their darkened instinct, which I value no more. We are dedicated to madness. That's why I love you, Sousa, you semper fidelis maniac." That poem, in some ways, a critique of American patriotism and a view into smaller town life. So, Edward Dorn, please read him. Let him take you to his teachers, Creeley and Olson, and possibly even to people who he would later go to as teachers, like the Latin poet Martial, the master of the satiric epigram, and many others. Follow poetry. Thank you.
1, 2, 3.